Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, February 20th, 2023. And being that today is President's Day, I thought it was appropriate to talk a little bit about executive power. So on this episode, instead of focusing on how things are supposed to be, what an oath-keeping president should be doing, instead I want to start with the position that the executive branch of today and of all of our lifetime, really, has had way too much power for way too long, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The head dude of the largest government in history is a monster, but we shouldn't be surprised because there are many who warned that this was going to play out this way, and it's only going to get worse until people start opposing executive power, no matter which team happens to sit in the Oval Office. But first of all, before getting to all that juiciness, a quick hello, a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I hope you had an awesome weekend, or maybe for some of you, you're still having an awesome weekend, but I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. And while we allow people another minute or so to get some time to get notifications to join us on the live stream platforms. We primarily live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Twitch. We also live stream over at Rumble and Odyssey, but sometimes the notifications aren't really fast. So let's say hi to everyone out in the live chat, and I really want to say thank you for being here once again. Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you, buddy. Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Kirk Morrison, South Carolina, AM in West Michigan. Tim Martin in Arizona. Hello to Senator D.T. Dixie Strong in Bama. Clay Kent, Alt Reality in Wisconsin, my original hometown. It's been a long time since I've lived there, but still have some family there. Alt Reality, Mike Takash. Erwin Havernick, been a while since we've seen you. Good to see you in Nebraska. And Grant also in Missouri. I know I missed a few people. There's hi from David, said, keep up the good work. Doing our best. We work very hard almost every single day of the year to get this kind of information out to more and more people. But anyways, let's take a look and see what we want to start out with. And I should mention that if you're thinking, oh, Bolden, where do I find the original source documents for that Patrick Henry quote that just kicked off the episode with? Well, everything that I'm going to be citing in this episode, well, I'm going to do my best to do everything that I'm citing in this episode. Sometimes I just ramble on and start bringing stuff up off the top of my head. But at least in my notes, I've got a bunch of reference links for other episodes, for original source documents, and the like. And I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And there you're going to find a show link section so you can look up this quote from Patrick Henry at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, who warned us. He saw what was going on. He looked at the structure of what was happening. And maybe we think Henry was great on constitutionalism, or like Thomas Jefferson thought he was terrible at it, actually. But Patrick Henry said, your president may easily become king. And whether we think of it specifically as a king in the royal hereditary monarch type of a way, or of the power of a king, I think there's some significant truth to that prediction by Patrick Henry. Your president may easily become king. So I'm starting out with the notion that, yes, the executive of the largest government in history has more power than most any executive in history. Most of them, there's probably a few that you could debate me about, but your president may easily become king was a pretty good prediction. Benjamin Franklin put it this way in the Philadelphia Convention. He didn't like the structure of the executive branch and wanted to change it. So we have Patrick Henry on one side, ardent anti-federalist. Benjamin Franklin, pretty ardent on the federal side, working very closely with James Wilson, one of the biggest big government guys of the time. He said the executive will be always increasing here, as elsewhere, till it ends in a monarchy. And I've got a little context on that quote that I'm going to wrap up the episode with at the end, so make sure you stick around, of course. Now, just because we don't have, like I was saying, we don't have a hereditary monarch today, that doesn't mean that Henry and Franklin and many others, their predictions were totally wrong, because they were concerned with the power of the office more than anything. And we know that the founders and the old revolutionaries didn't try to, well, at least the old revolutionaries didn't try to fight off the British with a long, bloody war and successfully do that in order to create a new version of that at home. And that's how Thomas Jefferson put it in 1784, notes on the state of Virginia. He said, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for. So even if you got rid of the monarchy, like as Thomas Paine railed against in Common Sense in 1776, and so many others did. Even if you get rid of a monarchy, if you just replace it with an elective version of it, that's not a land of the free. It's not even close. That doesn't fit within the notion of all those grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson was concerned about that. An elective despotism was not the government we fought for. And Richard Henry Lee put it almost the same way in a letter to Samuel Adams a few years later, October of 1787. Again, I will link to these source documents so you can read them in context. And this is really a paraphrase of it. Some of it is exact quote, but you can read it yourself. But basically, he was discussing this with Samuel Adams about the proposed Constitution. And he said, look, the people had not fought the British. They didn't get through this long, bloody war only to be brought under despotic rule under the notion of strong government or in the form of elective despotism. And he continued, he said, chains being still chains, whether made of gold or iron. Here's how Mike Meharry described things in an article, Executive Power, Who Made Presidents and Governors Kings. He said, in fact, the founding generation was particularly wary of vesting too much authority in a single individual. After all, it just fought a long, bloody war to free itself from the tyranny of a king. And Mike continues, and of course this will be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. He said the founding generation also sought to eradicate the concept of a powerful magistrate who ruled over the people and was empowered to make law. Think about that. They actually were willing to risk their lives against the notion of arbitrary government, which was one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. They called it a tyranny. They were not in the whole versions of tyranny in the Declaration, examples of unlimited centralized power in all cases whatsoever from the Declaratory Act. But they certainly saw that arbitrary government, a single person who could make law on a whim and basically decide what the law was going to be, that is the definition of a tyranny, even if that person happens to be doing everything right according to you. Because once that power is there, it establishes a precedent to grow and grow and grow. And if you think about that in context of what Benjamin Franklin was warning about during the Philadelphia Convention as they were drafting the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787. He's like, look what I see here. It's going to keep growing. We know human nature. We know the nature of government, and too much power is a bad thing. And he kind of regaled people, as a quick aside, he regaled people with a story of how things were in Pennsylvania in the years past. And he said, basically, nothing could get done because there was too strong of an executive. In a single executive. And he said nothing could ever get passed unless the executive was basically bribed. And maybe we don't see direct bribery to the executive branch today, but the entirety of the system that is so centralized in its power, think of all the grift that happens to go on with these politicians and their backers, their big money backers. You think that they're not maybe writing regulations to crush small business opposition when the big corporate people throw loot their way? I mean, maybe that's a different discussion, but I think it's the same concept against centralized power. So Mike writes, the founding generation, okay, so let me just back up. The founding generation also sought to eradicate the concept of a powerful magistrate who ruled over the people and who was empowered to make law. As the Americans split with Great Britain and forged ahead, forming new governments, multiple, they were ever fearful of giving power to individuals detached and unaccountable from the will of the people. That's a pretty good example of what we've lived under, at least for my whole life. So this is really about consolidation or centralization of power. And Richard Henry Lee, again, discussing this here, this was a letter to Patrick Henry in 1789. He said, the most essential danger from the present system arises from its tendency to a consolidated government. So Richard Henry Lee is the guy who in the Confederation Congress, once the Philadelphia Convention was done and sent the proposed Constitution there for, get them to sign off and send it off to the states, Richard Henry Lee was insisting on trying to get a Bill of Rights attached first. He didn't succeed, but he was very active in this whole process. And he was very concerned that he saw a long-term danger. Now, sometimes you only think short-term, and I think a lot of people tend to think just short-term. But part of what the anti-federalists, and some federalists as well, they thought about how things would play out over time. We know John Dickinson, for example, we could call him the father of the Articles of Confederation in many ways. Benjamin Franklin as well, but Dickinson, I think more specifically. But he was also a Federalist in support of the Constitution as well. But years earlier, we understood from Dickinson that every time you let them get outside their limits, you establish what he called the detestable precedent. So if you see something that can set up a precedent for more power, that would create a tendency for more power and more power and more power. It is ever grasping, as Abigail Adams warned us. So the most essential danger from the present system arises from its tendency to a consolidated government. Samuel Adams, up in Massachusetts, a very similar message just weeks earlier. This is in 1789. In a letter to Elbridge Gerry, this is again a paraphrase. The people of the United States under one consolidated government cannot long remain free, or indeed under any kind of government but despotism. And that brings me back to Jefferson, just with that kind of a foundation, the idea of too much power in too few hands or in a single person that had all kinds of power to do all kinds of stuff. So Jefferson was talking about this. He says the power, when he was talking about elective despotism, that's not what we fought for. So instead, he said the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of magistracy. The legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be separate and distinct, so that no person should exercise the powers of more than one of them at the same time. This, what I'm reading off from here is James Madison in the Federalist Papers, citing Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia from a few years earlier, talking about this separation of powers. And this is the idea of the tripartite system. You may have heard of that in, sometime back in school, but we can trace that back. The heavy influence, that probably more so than anybody, was really to a guy the founders called the celebrated Montesquieu. And here he is in the spirit of the laws in 1748. This is the summary of combining powers into one. And you tell me, I guess, what you think has been combined. I think a lot of it, if not all. It just depends on the situation. He said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. None. Again, he said, if there is no liberty, if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. And going on, he talks about violence, oppression. If, for example, if you can write the law, create law with a pen and just be the same person that executes the law, you're going to create tyrannical laws and execute them in a tyrannical manner. Sounds pretty familiar, right? But you can read that all in context. But here's how he sums it up. There would be an end of everything where the same man or the same body, whether of the nobles or of the people, elective despotism, for example, to exercise those three powers, that of enacting laws, that of executing the public resolutions, and of trying the causes of individuals. There's going to be no liberty. And this was very influential on the founders and old revolutionaries. Now, one of the greatest examples to the founders, or at least when we look at what they had to say about these things, one of the dangers of too much executive power was in the area of war powers. And they were very, very serious about this stuff. George Mason, Philadelphia Convention, August of 1787, he was against giving the power of war to the executive because not safely to be trusted with it. These are notes, so we can kind of guess how George Mason put this in his own words. Or to the Senate. He didn't want to even give the war powers to the Senate because it was not so constructed as to be entitled to it. He was for clogging rather than facilitating war. If the executive branch had the power to determine when the country is going to go to war and also has the ability to wage war, James Madison separately warned that they would declare war in order to wage it in that scenario. But he was very much against that. So he was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. He preferred declare to make war. That was George Mason in the Philadelphia Convention. James Madison agreed. Here he is writing a few years later in Helvidius number 4. Again, I'll link to this in the show notes. And Madison said there is no part, this is the wisest part of the Constitution. This is a guy that we often call the father of the Constitution, rightly or wrongly. I tend to disagree. But I can see why people do that. But James Madison thought the wisest part of the Constitution was about separating the power of declaring and making war. So declaring war is where you change the state of things from war to peace, or from peace to war. I'm sorry, getting that backwards. And the executive making war, they're the ones who they lead. They're the head dude in charge, the president general, I guess we can call him. We'll call him that here in a few minutes as well. In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. And why does Madison take this position? Because he was a student of history. He understood that people who had such great powers, the fewer the people who had the greater the powers, the more it would be abused. And to James Madison, he said war was perhaps the greatest threat to liberty because it gave us armies and debts and taxes. Armies, debts, and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. We do have a trifecta, but here's how Madison put it, student of history, unlike most of us today. Unfortunately, the Constitution supposes, and we're trying, right? The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature. So that's one of the areas. There are many others, but I just wanted to highlight that briefly. Now back to, this is an article I actually published about a year ago on separation of powers. And it starts out like this. James Madison considered the separation of powers. This is what we're talking about. Jefferson being cited by Madison. Jefferson referencing the tripart system, the separation of powers between executive, judicial, and legislative from Montesquieu, for example. You can also cite the Locke on that as well, a few others. But Madison considered the separation of powers so important, he not only called it a dogmatic maxim, he expressly included it as part of his proposed amendments for the Bill of Rights. He wanted to have a twin pillar of what a new Article 7 that would have been separation of powers and what became the 10th Amendment, reserved powers for the people and the states. I thought that was just interesting. You can check out that article as well. Now, despite the Federalist assurances, and I'm going to talk about that as we wrap up here in a few minutes, how the Federalists expected this to play out, they knew that the executive branch had a lot more power. They liked it, but they didn't seem to be too concerned that it was going to be abused in many ways, that some of the anti-Federalists. Now, Benjamin Franklin, of course, was a Federalist, and he was concerned as well. Now, despite the fact that Federalists over and over and over kept telling the people, okay, we've created this system, these are the wisest people, they created this system that it's going to check, and then the executive branch, if you don't like them, get rid of them, it'll work out. Now, a lot of the Anti-Federalists were not buying this. And I think Cato, the Anti-Federalist writer Cato back in 1787, 1788, he was one of the first Anti-Federalist writers to examine the executive branch. And I'm reading from an outline of an episode that I did on his fourth Anti-Federalist paper. He predicted it would, quote, tend either to the establishment of a vile and arbitrary aristocracy or monarchy. So that was his prediction. Looking at the structure of the executive branch over time, again, the Anti-Federalists were really looking long game on this, saying, okay, if we set this up for today, maybe things will be all right for a while, but what's going to happen in a long time? Understanding human nature and the maxim that power always grows. Government power will always seek to expand itself. So he predicted that the executive branch would tend, I like how he put this, to the establishment of a vile and arbitrary aristocracy. It is vile. Or monarchy, whatever we want to call it, with a permanent class of elites ruling from on high. Then in his fifth paper, he warned that the system in and of itself would not prevent, quote, the unbridled ambition of a bad man. So he saw that human nature, someone would come in there and look at all these powers, and for Cato, Brutus, and others, Federal Farmer, Patrick Henry, they were concerned about vague terms in the Constitution, general welfare, for example, necessary and proper. And even those who actually agreed with people like James Wilson about the legal meaning of those phrases, they recognized that a bad man with unbridled ambition would come into power and then just start reading it different ways. We see this happen year in and year out, decade in and decade out, executive in and, well, executive. After executive, after executive. Here's George Mason again. In September of 1787, this is the Philadelphia Convention, he concluded that the executive branch, when he was looking at this, would end either in a monarchy or tyrannical aristocracy, which he was in doubt. But one or another, he was sure. That was George Mason warning once again. Or here's an anti-federalist writer who I've not read a lot about, so I'm not sure who this was. It was Philadelphiensis, paper number 9 in February of 1788. He said, "Who can deny but the President General will be a king to all intents and purposes?" Again, if we're talking about context, what I was starting out right at the beginning, when Patrick Henry said, your president may easily become king. The argument from the anti-federalist side wasn't meaning that they were going to be coronated, but how they would act. And if you're trying to create a system, a federal system or a confederated republic, having a king runs totally counter that. They're totally opposite. Who can deny but the President General will be a king to all intents and purposes, and one of the most dangerous kind, too, a king elected to command a standing army. Again, an elective despotism in many ways can be more dangerous, and I know there's some arguments out there. Federal Farmer made a similar argument at some point as well. Once you get kind of the sanction, supposedly the sanction of the people at large, or the majority of the people, sometimes they get a little wilder with how bad they can be. And when they have a standing army, which all the founders actually thought was the bane of liberty in many ways. He said, "Thus our laws are to be administered by this tyrant. For the whole, or at least the most important part of the executive department, is put in his hand." Too much power in one person's hands, or, I mean, you can call it a deep state, but it's still directed by that same department. Whether we talk about the one king or the group of them in office, it is a centralized system. And here from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, they have a really good overview about the debates over executive power. And here's how they describe it. During the ratification debates, anti-federalists charged that the president would become an elected monarch, that cabals would develop to ensure his reelection, and that the presidential veto power would be abused. They feared, now, it wasn't just anti-federalists, because if you throw a wild card in there like Benjamin Franklin, it becomes even more interesting, but that's a side note. They further feared that presidential power to grant pardons would allow the president to conspire with others in treasonable activities with impunity. Now, I don't think they predicted everything there, but I certainly think they nailed the idea of king in whether it's for all intents and purposes, an elective despotism. I think they were really right on when it comes to that. Now, on the other hand, again, Federalists took a different position, and this is how they described it. They maintained that the president would be accountable to both the people and Congress. I think there was a lot of hope that there was going to be a good moral people, and people like on the Federalist side, like James Iredell, he expected that the people would resist when the government usurps powers, goes beyond its limits. So if you have a good people, even if you found a bad man that gets in power, then the people would keep him in check. But the people certainly failed to do that. They tried early on, but, well, the whole whiskey thing didn't go down in a different way. Anyways, if he failed to satisfy the people, he would not be reelected. If he committed crimes, he would be impeached by Congress. None of this is really played out the way that we were told, and then the system would self-enforce. Unfortunately, the people have gone along with a lot of this. And in fact, I think the bottom line is that a lot of people love this type of centralized power. They just like it for their own personal issues. And when you have that type of a situation, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. Going further, they write, furthermore, everyone realized that George Washington would be elected the first president. Washington had previously rejected total power in 1783, preferring retirement. He could be expected to follow a similar course of action after he set in motion the new government under the Constitution. Federalists argued that this example would be followed by his successors. And you can think that Washington was a great president or a terrible president. I think he did some really bad things. But that's another discussion again. But the idea was that Washington was a good, honorable, moral person. He wouldn't go in there with a goal to abuse the things. Now, even if he did make mistakes, and he talked about that himself, I may have screwed up on this and this, but his goal was certainly to try to do the right thing and then get out of power and then be out of there. He tried to step down after one term, but he was convinced by even Thomas Jefferson, you got to stick around because things are really problematic here. Even Jefferson, both Jefferson and Hamilton on the opposite ends of that spectrum, wanted Washington to stick around. So back to that quote from Benjamin Franklin, the executive will be always increasing here. Here's the context. And the context of Benjamin Franklin is really the same that we're getting here from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. Everyone understood that George Washington was going to be president. Now, the only kind of wrench in that was that maybe Virginia wouldn't ratify. So there were some backup plans to figure out who would be the president if it wasn't George Washington. I think the most likely person pushed for that would probably have been John Hancock if he was not ill, but that never happened. Maybe a different timeline. So here's Benjamin Franklin in context. Again, this is the Philadelphia Convention. He's arguing against the single executive with a huge veto power and all this stuff. And he said, the first man put at the helm will be a good one. He's referencing George Washington, who's there. The first man will be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will be always increasing here, as elsewhere, till it ends in a monarchy. Now, he didn't say the first man in office would not be part of this increasing here, and I'm not sure if I can even make the claim that Franklin was warning against that. But he recognized that it will always increase, and if you have a good person in there, they're going to step away and they're not going to keep trying to grow it, but then someone else is going to come in and they're going to use that power and they're going to take it and grow it and grow it and grow it and grow it. And I think the more that we pay attention to this type of a warning, the more that we think that no matter who's in power, the executive has way too much power. We don't want him doing anything. Basically, get out of the way of everything. And even if we're wrong 10% of the time with that approach, we're better off at 90% correct than 100% wrong, which is really how it is today. Anyways, I'm going to take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions we can get back to, or I can get back to here. I should also mention that if you support our work and you want to help me get this kind of message out to more and more people every single day, me, Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, Alan Mosley, and so many other people that help and support and do the work behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes, you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, lifetime, 5-year options. You can check it all out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look over in the live chat. Larry Clark has got a great point. The legislature has totally neglected their job on reining the executive in. And one of the great examples, again, we can look at war powers. An authorization to use military force, AUMF, in these more modern ones that have substituted for the declaration of war process as required by the Constitution. Now, you don't have to use those terms, but an authorization to use military force in modern times is authorizing the executive to decide when and against who a war will be started. So it's transferring the power to the executive branch. So in some ways, it's even worse than what Larry's saying. They're, not keeping the executive in check. They're not impeaching for anything but usually political reasons. It's electioneering, basically. But on top of it, they're oftentimes transferring power to the executive branch, or they let unconstitutional agencies write the laws, which is part of the executive branch as well. That's an important point. I appreciate you making that, Larry, and it's always good to see you here. Kirk Morrison points out a list of modern presidents that abused executive fiat. They used, of course, the executive order. Now, of course, an executive can use executive orders to tell constitutional agencies how to implement constitutional things, or just the work they're supposed to do. Oh, you guys are off this week, or whatever it may be. Maybe that's a terrible analogy, but what they've done instead is when they can't get something they want passed through Congress, and most of the time what they want passed through Congress shouldn't be passed by Congress either, but when they don't, they just they tell an agency to redefine a word so a pre-existing law that also shouldn't exist now encompasses something else. DT says Michigan needs to be brought back under its own constitution. We have to think about the state constitutions as well. One of these days, I really want to start digging in on that approach. A lot of people tend to think that everything is a constitutional issue on a national level. And all you end up getting as a result of that is one side fighting with the other to control everything. And I think if we start focusing on our state constitutions, that would be a very, very good approach. Richard Henry Lee, in one of those letters that I was citing early on here, talking about consolidation and executive power, elective despotism and all that, he basically said, he was concerned with the amendments that were being proposed in Congress in 1789. He was unhappy with the final result. And he said, I tried my best to get everything from our own country. So he was referring to Virginia as his country in this letter, probably to Patrick Henry, what we worked on during the ratification debates, but he said specifically in our country. Anyways, I'll look a little bit further in the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. You can also leave comments in the archive. Those actually help trigger the algorithms of these mainstream platforms and tells those platforms to show us to more people. So to smashing the like button, leaving reviews, probably on Apple Podcasts. I've seen some research that says it doesn't, but I appreciate all the reviews. That certainly helps out a lot. It helps us spread the word because we can share that with other people. And if they see that you like it, they may be more interested in checking out our show as well. So I appreciate all those. Appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Hope you're having an awesome Monday. And I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.